Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is simply called Discerning What is True. Today is the 28th day of October 2025. I'm going to be reading from a particular book. It's simply called Psychology and Kabbalah. The author is also the author of this particular book that Phil Langdon spoke to me about years ago. This is Kabbalah, Tradition of Hidden Knowledge. This is by Thames and Holmes, I think it is. I'm sorry, Hudson. Thames, Thames, and Hudson. And this is has a lot of pictures in it. This particular one does, but also has a lot of symbols in it. But I'm not going to be reading from this particular book. Hopefully, we're going to be able to share this in the near future with me and Phil talking about it with Kabbalah. Bill Langdon recommended this book because he said it was the most thorough book, in his opinion, being the truth of what Kabbalah is all about. You know, there's a lot of people out there just talking about a lot of things, and they're reading from other books that basically maybe don't have their T's crossed and their I's dotted. So let's get into the work here. So thank you for being here as the audience, and then I will share this also on my channel that is on. I'll share it on Facebook, but I'm basically recording it here on YouTube. Unless anybody here can, ask questions if you want to. I don't know if I can answer them. This is a new perspective. Not a new perspective, just a new book I've been reading here. So thank you for being here. So the book starts out with simply, so shall the knowledge of wisdom be unto thy soul when thou hast found it. Then there shall be a reward based upon Proverbs 24:14. Figure 1, inner levels. Here the interior dimensions of a human being are shown related to the psyche, spirit, and divine aspects of a person. Robert Flood, F-L-U-D-D, a Rosicrucian, did not get the annotation quite right, but he got the 4 worlds of the Kabbalah correct with the tree of life configuration at the top. The period of this picture was when the, quote, West was shifting from religion and philosophy to the occult and science. This is 17th century woodcut. Preface. When Adam and Eve came down from Eden, so this is something that most people don't understand. So let's try to go into this. When Adam and Eve came down from Eden, E-D-E-N. Okay, we have an idea that Eden is actually in Mesopotamia. That may not be correct, folks. So we continue. There began a process of incarnation and comprehension into why they had been brought into being. The situation recurs each time we are born. As we learn about physiology and how it differs from that other reality whence we came. Most soon forget this prenatal memory, but some seek to return to that state of soul by looking within. Psychology is the study of this archetypical world that hovers between earth and heaven. And Kabbalah is a spiritual tradition that places the psyche, inner and outer counterparts in the context of the greatest reality. Combined, these bodies of ancient and modern knowledge can bring into focus the nature and purpose of our descent into matter. So we're in matter, and matter simply means the body. This is the carrier. This is the outer shell. As the self of each individual passes through level after level to become one with the divine self. He has this self in all caps, who gazes through our eyes upon his own reflection. This is it says London in the summer. And he has a tree of life here, which I cannot share with you, but it is in this particular book. You can actually download this book absolutely free on We Live. That is WELIB.org, I think it is. Is absolutely free. It doesn't cost you anything. It'd be well worth it. Look into it. Figure 2, the general scheme of the psyche. Here, Kabbalistic psychology draws upon ancient, medieval, and modern terms to fill in the structure and dynamic of the tree of life. Now, let's go back up here and let's explain something here. If I understand what Phil says, well, all of us come here and we're on the tree of good and evil. Our idea simply is we want to be on the tree of life. See, because the idea with the tree of good and evil is that simply is you're divided. There are good aspects of you and there are bad aspects of you. And what you want to do is get off that tree. Every time we reincarnate here, we are on the tree of good and evil. Okay? And we want to get on the tree of life, which means simply no longer double-minded, single-minded, you see. As this diagram is called, this will be the basics reference system of the book. Always remembering that this tree is but a part of a ladder of trees of all existence. The Hebrew names are keys to the principle of the 10 plus 1 separah, for memberers. I think that should be for numbers, while the 22 paths reveal the function of the triads. The thesis is that a human being is a microcosm of the macrocosm of a universe based upon a divine plan. And that's his quote. And I'm going to explain. I think I would just simply say Halevi, Halevi. He's the writer of this particular book and the other book I shared earlier. So we go into the introduction section of it, and he's going to say simply this: psychology is the science of the mind. The Greek root word is psyche, meaning soul, or that which is not of the body, but is the invisible component of a person. In prehistorical times, death was recognized as the moment of division between the body and what emanated it. All over the world, people acknowledge this phenomenon and indeed take enormous pains to placate or honor the departed intelligence. Anyone who has seen the corpse of someone well known to them experiences the same sense of total absence, not only of life, but of that peculiar essence which made the person unique. In other words, their personality, how they did certain things. You see, if you remember your parents, the same thing. This recognition of an unseen yet palpable dimensions of a human being must have generated the first inquiries into what it was that came into being at birth, possessed a certain character during life, and disappeared at death. Here began psychology. In the earliest stages of humanity life on Earth, the main preoccupation was to learn to survive, you see. People had to adapt to the interplay of the 4 elements, to use plants and to relate to animals. Now, while these first human beings may have been primitive, their consciousness was of a quite different order from anything that they might have encountered in the wilderness. Not only did they observe the ways of nature as the seasons turned, but they recorded and collected experiences in a manner that no other species could. Animals might respond to a drought by migrating or sleep through the winter to avoid its difficulties. But this was an inbred instinct, you see, completely unconscious at the individual level. You see, we don't respond by instinct here. You see, what an animal is completely different. We have another nature, so to speak. We have free will. They don't have free will. You see, they're just responding to instinct. Human beings saw the realms of the earth, recurring patterns. then as principles from which they built up a piece of the universe in which they had lived. The most intelligent and sensitive of these early shamans formulated their conclusions into myths that explain the processes in the world about them. So remember what you just said there, because this is key for even reading scripture. It says myths. It doesn't say a literal story here, folks. It says myths, because they didn't understand what was going on, so they wrote myths, because that's how they communicated long ago. These speculations included the origins of the human race, whence it came and whither it was going. It is known that not a few had experiences of revelation in which they were shown the situation of mankind from a higher dimension. One such person was Enoch. He's in Genesis chapter 5. He, according to the Kabbalistic legend, is said to be the source of various esoteric traditions that pass on these mystical illuminations. By the time the first civilization arose in Egypt and Mesopotamia, complete cosmology had come into being about the world that lay behind the mundane events of their daily life. Periodical upheavals of war, earthquake, or famine were accepted as moods of the gods and goddesses who inhabited the invisible realm from which people came at birth and returned to at death. Great priests and kings sacrifice and deed might influence events, but ultimately the upper worlds rule the lower, you see, because no one except perhaps the mystics and the magicians understood the laws of those unseen levels. Now, while birth and death were the dramatic entry and exit points of the unknown region, and therefore of great interest to everyone, there were some who were particularly interested in what went on between. Most people, as was noted, just existed, oblivious of any purpose but to survive. Others were more outgoing and dominating, while still others retired or sought to live an interior life, either in madness or deliberate contact with the invisible realms. These observations led to speculations about types of people, temperaments, and fate, which is the distinct pattern of a life as a person's particular nature interacts with the condition to which they were born. The Jews and Greeks were the first, that is, in the Western world to consider these questions methodically. Although influenced by the Persians and the Indian views of the universe, the Jewish approach was basically prophetic, in mode, while the Greek applied intellectual analysis. Both pondered the place of mankind in the universe and examined the performance of the individual. The stories of the Bible and the Greek legends are about people relating to the supernatural worlds. In each tradition, certain characters embody a human vice or virtue under trial. Thus, Jacob and heroes such as Ulysses undergo their development while others around them move unconsciously through the drama of existence. So he's pointing out here something here that is very key. There's so few people who it's not so few, but so many who are completely unconscious of what's going on in life. Okay. This may be because simply they've been here only a very few times. That is, they've been incarnated here a couple times, and they basically have no clue why they're here, what their purpose is, or anything of that nature. In fact, that's probably 99% of the people on this planet, if not more. The theme of inner evolution occurs in all mythology. As individuals that is struggle to emerge from a tribal group to become people who do not just live on the mundane level, but who consciously participate in the cosmic process of divine manifestation. Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad were examples of highly developed human beings who could not only talk with ordinary folk, but converse with beings of the upper worlds and gods. And God, I should say, not gods. Between the poles of simple physical consciousness and total realization is a great spectrum of human experiences. This is divided by all esoteric traditions into the realms of the body, soul, spirit, and divine. Psychology is concerned primarily with the world of the mind, which has access to the body, contains the soul, is penetrated by spirit, and touched by the divine. This book is an attempt to set the study of psychology within the scheme of Kabbalah, which takes into account the origins of all human beings and the divine, spiritual, and physical composition. We shall give particular attention to the psyche and the great journeys of destiny that each one of us makes as we descend into incarnation and the return whence we come. However, in order to understand and fuse the discipline of psychology and Kabbalah, we must examine the history of our present situation at every level. This means extracting the most important elements of each subject and interweaving their relevance so as to make a synthesis which can give new insights into both. Various schools of thought will be drawn upon, not only to give a broad view, but to cover all the stages and levels of unfoldment. Naturally, there will be omissions of some areas, owing to the limit of space and my own experience. However, if this work brings the Kabbalah and the psychologists into contact, then it will have served its purpose. The next thing has a graph here of what I call the Adam Catman. This is said to be, that is the Adam Catman, is said to be the image of the absolute in a human form. As a primordial atom, it is divine in essence, but contains in its pictorial dimensions all the attributes that will govern existence. Neither angel nor any animal contains such a complete format. As the image of the macrocosm, Adam Catman is where all human beings come from before they descend into the three lower worlds of creation, formation, and action. This is from Ginsburg, The Kabbalah, 19th century. Chapter 1. Prior to the ancient Greeks, a systematic study of the psyche in the Western world did not exist. The presence of the soul was recognized, but what was known was either confined to the esoteric schools, such as the ones at Eleusis, I'll spell that to you, Eleusis, Eleusis, or embedded within folklore. Such information might be in the observation of apparatuses, or apparitions, I should say, of the dead, the meaning of dreams, and stories about adventures among the gods. Fragments of knowledge have come down to us, but they are usually cast in the form of allegory, which needs interpretation into the language of our time. At this point in history, Western man was still of the what we call at the superstitious phase of development, in which unusual phenomena were noted but not understood, so that the natural and supernatural were confused. An example of this was the belief in the gods of the underworld and that the soul went downwards after burial into their domain. When the Greeks came into contact with the older and much more advanced civilizations of the East in their campaigns of conquest and trade, there occurred a cultural alchemy in which the rational intelligence of the Greeks was fired and fused with the religious and philosophical experiences of the Oriental mind. Besides the contacts with the Persians and the Indian civilization and the connections with the Egyptians, there was also the meeting between the Hellenistic and Judaistic cultures that produced the ground bed of Christendom and Islam. The impact of the interaction stimulated not only an intellectual approach to cosmology, but also to psychology as the Greeks began to examine their own myths and extract a rationale to the structure and dynamic of the macrocosm and the microcosm of the universe and mankind. Around the 6th century before the Common Era, Greek science had concluded that there was a distinct difference between sense and reason, inasmuch as the mind synthesis what the body perceived. Likewise, the notion of different temperaments was observed and related to the four elements in it as above, so below, end quote, formula, so below, so beloved by the mystical philosophers around the 5th century BCE. The Pythagorean school differentialities between the psyche and the body, which they saw as a prison for the soul while the person was incarnated. They believed that life was a process of learning as the soul slowly worked towards inner freedom, purification, and immortality in its transcendence of the cycle of natural birth, growth, decay, and death. Those schools not concerned with the development aspect formed upon more pragmatic questions, and here we get the great division between Platonic and Aristotelianism approach, which have split the study of psychology right down to our day. You see, Plato followed the mystical line in that he saw the universe emerge from an invisible realm into a manifestation, while Aristotle, the scientist, observed that these subtle realms were inherited in a material world. He saw the psyche as the sum or essence of a living body, while Plato perceived it as a non-physical organism which could be reborn again and again after death. At a more detailed level of observation of the incarnate psyche, the Greeks began to differentiate distinct functions of activities such as the nutritive, sensitivity, and rational, which correspond to the plant, the animal, and human levels of a person. They also became preoccupied with the morality of the people and the various drives of the body as they came into conflict. The process of primitive impulses slowly being organized into complex conscious actions was also recognized, as was the principles of wish and fulfillment in dreams when the higher faculties were asleep and the baser appetites could be released without social condemnation. Many of these early conclusions were incorporated into the various systems that arose in the Hellenistic view of the psyche. The Stoics, for example, saw a sense impression as an awareness in the consciousness of the psyche. They also differential between imagination and hallucination and a subjective conviction from an objective reality. They also concluded that the innate reason in animals that cause them to behave in certain ways should be defined as instinct, which is quite different from a human being capacity of consciousness based upon an inner knowledge of the laws of the universe. And then he has a figure here, figure 4, which is called the seat of the soul. Some medieval studies of psychology show the soul as residing in the ventricles within the brain and others in the chambers of the heart. What all agreed upon was that there was a human and an animal level within a person. The more philosophical and metaphysical belief there was yet a higher factor in what was called the active intelligence or intellect, which has access to the divine dimension. Put together, these would define what would be called Jacob's ladder, which was a Kabbalistic version of the mystical and philosophical chain of being. This was again a medieval woodcut. The effects of Hellenistic thinking upon the Jewish and later the Christian Islam and the Islamic view of the psyche was enormous. Philo, Philo, a Jew who lived in Alexandria about the same time as Jesus of Nazareth was born, sought to amalgamate the revelation of the Bible with Greek thought. He rationalized many of the things contained in the scriptures as allegories of reality. So here's the key that most people do not get. In fact, most people in the church do not get this at all. They have a literal framework, and that's all they know. And Jesus said something very clear. You have to be like children. Some people don't understand that. Well, what that means simply is children relate more to allegories, you see, and myths. They're in a what we call a dream world, so to speak. As we as adults are not in that particular state. But what Jesus is saying simply, unless you are of that type of mind, you won't see it. That's very clear, because those who look at the literal framework of the Bible have misunderstood the Bible in all kinds of ways. In so many ways, folks. Relating various biblical characters certain qualities and levels of development. This process was taken up by the more radical Jewish thinkers, but it was not incorporated into the Orthodox outlook until it had passed through the Neoplatonic versions of Christianity and Islam, by which time the psyche had been examined and defined in great detail. The open acceptance came when Kabbalah moved out of its traditional seclusion to oppose the philosophical logic that was attracting and threatening the unquestionable or unquestioning faith, not only of the intelligentsia of Judaism, but of Islam and Christendom in the early Middle Ages. In the crisis between reason and revelation, the nature of the psyche was brought into deep focus as various mystical spoke openly about the many components, functions, problems, and resolutions relating to the inner life. Discussions about the soul in the rabbinical study house, the monastic cell, and Sufi school explored every aspect and level until the creative impulses was set, and the universities became mere places of repetition and information based upon what the ancient and medieval masters had said. It was not until the Renaissance that psychology started to move again, as inquiring people began to look at the field afresh. In other words, it began to look at it in a different perspective. Work by the Anatomius Vesalius in the 16th century removed many ideas about the psyche being dependent upon the body, as some ancients have said, and social observers such as Machiavelli, who were a practical textbook for princes, swept away the academia idea that people were inherently noble. It was only too clear in first time of political expediency that the primitive side of a human being could predominate. This led to a reformational of psychology and its implications with studies of the effect of society upon the individual. In other words, they're looking at what they call society, the mass, what we call today kind of like the mass mind upon the individual, and how individuals are, are swayed, or not swayed, but we feel that the individual feels as though they're being crushed in some ways in this way because of society, because people keep going in what we call a massness. Conversely, scholars like Thomas Hobbes moved in another direction and developed a mechanicalistic approach, seeing dreams, for example, as caused solely by external factors. This mode was in line with the influence of Galileo, which had destroyed the ancient picture of the world and all its mysteries with celestial mechanics. The age of reason that was born out of this, what we call these standpoints, was opposed by the Platonists of the time, such as the Cambridge School of Henry More. But they were out of fashion, you see. Even Newton, a mystic of the first order, had to hide the fact that most of his notes were about religious issues. Outwardly, little real psychological study was carried out during the 17th and 18th centuries, although much work was done on the mechanism and theoretical approach, which led to many conclusions based upon empirical method. The extreme rationalism of this period produced in reaction from the most pedestrian edifices of theory to a blind fascination with the irrational, such as the magnetic processes of mesmerism. In an age obsessed with exquisite style and the perfecting of machinery, madness was not understood and was treated in the most barbaric way. was not until the it was not until the emergence of social consciousness that people sought to examine the psyche of the individual. By the late 19th century, there were numerous schools of psychology, some studied from a physiology standpoint, while others considered the sociological perspective, functional, and behavioral aspects. Schools like the Gestalt explored the effects of the environmental on the psyche, in contrast to the analytical procedures then being developed to probe the structure of the mind. Out of this melee of scientific investigation came Freud, who opened up the world of unconsciousness with his powerful forces that permeated consciousness to influence people without their knowledge, causing neurosis, psychosis, and occasional irrational behavior in the so-called normal. Freud's contribution to Western psychology was enormous. He not only rediscovered what esoteric schools had taught about 4 centuries, but began to systematize the mind in a scientific way, although he did meet a lot of resistance from his own profession, that is Carl Jung, his younger colleague who had been developing his own views of the psyche, took up the Platonic stance to Freud's Aristotelical approach. He saw that while the psyche had its primitive drives, it was also subject to a deeper influence coming from the higher levels of the unconscious. Thus, the ego of the lower psyche was separated out from the self, which supervised the processes of development described in spiritual texts and myths. Today, there is a great interest in the West in esoteric. This has brought many people to recognize that psychology is a prerequisite before moving on into the study of spirit and divine. Here's where psychology and the esoteric can meet, mutually adapt, and start an alchemy for our age. But before this can begin, we must consider the idea of revelation as a source of knowledge. And we're going to stop here. This was chapter 1, and the next chapter will be Revelation. So I'm going to stop here at this point. I appreciate you being here. I wish you a good day. Thank you for listening.